everybody, and thank you very much for attending one of the Technology Ireland ICT Skillnet broadcasts. My name is Jacky from Accenture. I lead the cybersecurity practice for Accenture in Ireland. I also sit on the board of Cyber Ireland as vice chair. Cyber Ireland is an organisation which brings together industry, academia and government for the promotion of cybersecurity from lots of different lenses across Ireland. And I also lecture in UCD on their masters in cybersecurity. And before we get started, I suppose, why am I speaking about ransomware today? Well, I've had the pleasure or not, as the case might be, of assisting a lot of my clients to try and help them survive ransomware attacks. And this is quite a big problem for people today. And I think part of this is all about knowledge being power, that if you have knowledge and you're forearmed in relation to this type of attack, it can actually make a difference. I'm very conscious that we've quite a varied audience here. So I'm going to try and speak to everybody. For those who, are on to try and learn a little bit about some concepts, what is ransomware and what's it about? To those who are interested in hearing about a couple of case studies, and also for protection. So every now and then I might dip into kind of a couple of more technical things, but I will try and keep it fairly general for the general audience that's participating today. The first thing is, what exactly is ransomware? It's a form of malware, as in bad software, that criminals will try and put onto your systems to elicit money from you, is the usual target, but it may be, also to try and embarrass you. Sometimes they have different kind of ways or different motivations behind why you might get hit with ransomware. And also, they're not always targeted attacks with ransomware. Sometimes you just could be pure unfortunate and you get infected because somebody you know or is connected to has become infected. So there are different ways of it spreading as well. But usually they will try and lock your system, and they will ask you to give them money, typically in the form of Bitcoin, to try and get back whatever it is that they've removed access from. And that's often by either taking your files or maybe just encrypting or scrambling your files so that you no longer have access to them. Usually an attacker will just scramble the files on your system, but we are seeing more and more that they're actually taking the data and taking a copy of the data, rather than just encrypting them on your system, which obviously is a little bit harder for you to address and actually come out the other side of if you're unfortunate enough for this to happen to you. And just some recent surveys that we've done in Accenture, actually, that about 11% of cyber attacks that people are reporting at the moment are ransomware related. But it's one of those cyber attacks that people are a little bit less inclined to report than some of the other ones. So just to be aware of that. How does it usually happen? How do they take advantage and actually get hold of your network? So I've got two different kind of little paths, one on the left and one on the right. And one of them is where they actually just try and deliver some kind of exploit to you. So it could be that you're visiting a website and they try to elicit some kind of reaction from you when you're on the website, to download something or to click on something or to get you further into something. And as part of that process, they will actually deliver malware onto your system, which in turn will kick off the whole ransomware process and start to encrypt files. The other way, we see it getting delivered via malicious email, where you get an email. And again, that email is designed to try and socially engineer you, to entice you to click on a link and go through something, which again will kick off an executable, run a program on your system, and then kick off the ransomware. Not all ransomware actually, when it starts to try and encrypt files on your system, will click off immediately and actually start reacting. Some of it will go slowly and will actually sit and wait for a little while when systems are a little bit quieter, so you may not notice that something's going on. And we have noticed, unfortunately, that throughout the COVID-19 epidemic, that people are using, enticements in relation to, oh, look, here's a cure, here's something else. So the clickbait that they're putting in place to try and entice you to click on things is very COVID-19 related, because they're finding people are more likely to click on that sort of link at the moment. How does it work? So generally, ransomware will target just the data files on your system. And, some types of ransomware will only attack particular types of data files. clearly the data is the thing that you find valuable on your system. And you'll have a lot of other files on your systems, like operating systems or application programs. And it generally doesn't go near those because it's not interested. They're not valuable. They're not unique to you. And they're usually easier to reinstall and re-download again. So, people typically wouldn't pay ransom money to get those back. And part of the reason why they only go for the data files is it's much faster. So they're just doing a finite portion of your system to actually encrypt that. So the process actually happens more quickly and you're less likely to notice it while it's mid-process. In theory, what happens is that the malware will set a key to encrypt your system with, which will both is used for the encryption, and basically a derivative or a relationship to that key is used to decrypt the system back again. So in theory, they're meant to send those keys off to a command and control server so that when you pay the ransom, you will get the key to decrypt your things back again. But as we'll see later on, that doesn't always happen. You don't always get the information back. Often ransomware as well will try to replicate itself and spread onto systems that are nearby on your network. And there's several vectors that it will use to try and do that. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail on a couple of different variants of ransomware we see and explain how they try to replicate themselves. And there's a sample here on this slide as well about what it might look like. I think this is a Wannacry sample. And this is what typically pops up on your screen by the time they've actually encrypted everything. And so it's usually a little bit too late by the time you see this. So you have to hope that you're going to spot that beforehand. We are noticing that ransomware is getting a little bit more sophisticated. So sometimes when it gets onto your system, it's trying to do things like disable your antivirus, disable your login, and even going so far as to deleting some of the backups that might be on your system. So you've less recourse to get back to your previous state before they got in if they cause that type of damage. Because clearly, if you can just restore your system back up to the state it was in an hour earlier, which there are features built into a lot of common operating systems like Windows, for example, to allow you to do that. If you've got that switched on, then the ransomware is absolutely useless on your system. It's very fast to kind of get it back up and running again. And sometimes they will also put a timer on it and say, if you don't pay by this time, we'll destroy your data or potentially publish your data. And we have seen examples of that actually happening. So here's a couple of samples of different variants that we've seen out in the wild kind of going around. Wannacry is probably one of the more famous ones. It got a lot of publicity at the time when it hit the National Health Service in the UK, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. That came out in around about 2017, and it was interesting because it started using what we call a worm through a particular Windows protocol called SMB, Server Message Block, to start replicating across different systems. So it was using exploiting a vulnerability that was in that. Now that's typically used to help people do things like share files with other people on their network or share printers with people. So it's there for useful purposes, for genuine purposes. But there was a vulnerability in relation to this that was discovered by the NSA in the US. And when this kind of quite well discussed hack that happened into them, where a group called the Shadow Brokers took some of their what we call 0-day vulnerabilities, as in new vulnerabilities that people didn't know about, and actually published them eventually for all to use. And this was a particularly dangerous one because it was a way of allowing malware to self-replicate. So basically, if you got Wannacry on one of your systems, it could spread around the place. And I remember so clearly the day that Wannacry hit everybody around, particularly in Ireland, because my phone was hopping and everyone was saying, is this thing copying itself? Like, what's happening? It was so new at the time. And it was actually really scary for people because they were just watching their networks kind of go ping, 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 and everything just disappearing. Some other variants that we've seen around the place, and they do tend to have rather silly names, like Bad Rabbit. Like Bad Rabbit was something that we saw that kind of was hitting a lot in the energy sector. There was a group called Black Energy, I think their name was, and it was related to another piece of ransomware called NotPetya, which again was something that was quite in the forefront of the media at the time. We saw a lot of this going around the place. It has a slightly different way of replicating. And instead of just damaging the files on the system, it also did what we call bricking the system. And it went to the very, very start of a disk called the master boot record, which when you turn on a system, it tells the system where to go and how to boot and what to do with itself. And so it destroyed this as well. So you actually needed two parts to come back and rebuild from this malware bad rabbit. So if you didn't get in touch with the people who'd actually encrypted the system, your chances of actually getting these back were quite slim. It was quite a difficult one to get back from. So some of the more high profile ransomware attacks that we've seen kind of in recent years, one of them was with the Maersk shipping giant. And basically they had a really devastating ransomware attack, which struck all across their business in 2017. And they pretty much lost everything across their infrastructure. Some of the things they managed to save, like their table of all the users and passwords and how they could log in, they only saved a lot of that because there was a server that was down. And so it wasn't live at the time and it didn't get destroyed. But they had a very flat network architecture, which meant once one of these worm type ransomware malware kind of got into their system, it was able to replicate very quickly. And I think it only took like about 4 hours to get their whole network. And they're such a huge organization. And the scale of it was just unbelievable to them. And if you think about the impact on their business, like they'd ships out in the sea, they'd containers in the docks, all their records, they no longer had access to them. So they didn't know where the ships were going. They didn't know what was in the containers, who owned the stuff, all the bill of materials, about everything. So it was really devastating for them. And I think they had like 4,000 servers, 45,000 PCs, loads of different applications that they lost. And basically it hit everything. It hit their backups. They were completely wiped out by it. So they had to start from scratch and rebuild. And it took many, many hours and reputedly cost them about $300 million to actually recover from that. Another highly publicized attack was in the National Health Service in the UK, and they were hit with Wannacry 2017. And this basically, again, kind of, spread very quickly through a lot of the older infrastructure they had in the National Health Service. So it hit things like X-ray machines where they had older versions of Windows, like Windows XP. And the problems that it caused them there were huge. They had to cancel appointments. They had to close off operating theatres. It even went out kind of connecting to some of the GP practices around the country. And reputedly, it cost them around £100 million to actually restore back to some state of operation. And about 19,000 appointments were cancelled over the period that they were hit. And again, you can think of, the impact on an organization and the people and the panic that this actually ensues when something like this happens to an organization. So this is very widely reported at the time. We've also seen 2018, the city of Atlanta, again, similar pattern, that they get alerted, there's a computer outage. They begin to realize that it's got something to do with ransomware. It's spread. It's gone across lots of different city departments. Things like Wi-Fi in the airports and emergency services and all these things were hit with them. Nobody has ever confirmed or denied in relation to the payment of the ransom in this situation. So it's widely believed, but I don't have fact behind that they actually paid the ransom in order to get access to their files again. And, kind of while law enforcement and a lot of people would recommend that you shouldn't do that, I personally won't sit in the seat of judgment on people, because you really need to look at, how mature your operations are and what your ability is to restore, back to kind of normal operations if you don't pay the ransom. But clearly there is absolutely no guarantee if you do pay the ransom that you're going to get things back. And very recently, this month, Honda were actually hit by ransomware. And they've been public about it. It was confirmed to be snake ransomware, which was first identified in 2019. And certainly some people have been trying to contact the people who reputedly run that ransomware operation. They have neither confirmed or denied that it was anything to do with them. But Honda had to temporarily shut down some of its production financial facilities as a result of this. So, it really is very kind of embedded, and it is happening all the time. And we're not seeing it going away. If anything, we're actually seeing the incidence of ransomware rise at the moment. In relation to the business model, historically, ransomware requests were actually quite small because they wanted to entice people to pay. Like if you're thinking, will I pay, $3,000 in Bitcoin, or will I spend months and months and months trying to rebuild my systems? Sometimes you may make the decision about paying, but actually lately we're beginning to see the volume of the amount in the ransom rising. So it's trending upwards and it's getting to be quite considerable at this stage. And as I said earlier, just because you pay the ransom, it absolutely does not guarantee that you're going to get back access to your data. Quite often, there is no decryption key to be had. They've just encrypted your data. And even if they have, just because you've got it back, you're not sure that you're actually, they don't have a copy of the data. You want to have fairly good monitoring on your systems to be able to track back and say, we can see that no data was exfiltrated from our organization as a result of what was going on. I think in general, we would strongly say to people, try not to pay, because it's only making the problem worse and encouraging people to kind of get more into it. However, we do sometimes see organizations quietly paying. To try and combat some of this, a group was set up called No More Ransom, which is kind of a linkage between law enforcement, between a lot of the cybersecurity organizations. The idea is that they actually have a bank of decryption keys that they might have recovered from where they had infiltrated a hacking group, or sometimes you'll find that different companies, I know like FireEye had kind of a cache of keys at one stage, so they were all put into this, and that the online portal that No More Ransom run has actually assisted quite a lot of people. So it would be one of the first things that we would do when we're looking at a kind of a ransomware attack for people, is to see whether or not it's going to be easy for that decryption key to work for them. And typically what we would do in that situation, these are a lot of the organizations that are involved in it actually. So as you'll see, there's a lot of very reputable organizations involved. But typically what happens is if you've been hit by ransomware, you can get onto No More Ransom. You give them a couple of sample files that have actually been encrypted, and they will run them past their database and see, can they decrypt them? And if they can, great, you can get the decryption keys and go ahead and decrypt things. But, I've seen kind of it being hit and miss, like they don't have every decryption key for everything. Clearly, it's just that over the years, they have gathered quite a lot, and they have helped quite a lot of organizations to get themselves out of a mess. What can you do if you actually find yourself to be infected? We would normally class somebody as being in that patient zero mode. So you really do hope that the patient zero, the first person that gets hit, actually notices that something's wrong and reports it. And that could be that there's a lot of activity on their system. They're hearing the fan hit off on their system. They're saying there's something going on my system at the moment. I don't like the look of it. Or your IT department could have actually set something up that is actually monitoring systems to look for the signs of ransomware happening. But you really hope that patient zero is going to notice it. Like I actually came across during an investigation once where somebody saw something going wrong in their system on a Friday evening, and they actually just closed their laptop and walked away. And you can imagine the devastation that wreaked over the weekend while it was just left there. So you also would want to hope that when it does happen, that whoever you're reporting it to in your own organization, in the IT department, would understand how to quickly isolate an infected system so that they're trying to halt the spread of it. And then a lot of it is around kind of preparation as well. So if you're aware that you may get hit by ransomware, which anybody could, because as I said earlier, it's not necessarily targeted. You can just be unfortunate and get hit by it. Making sure that you've got good backups of your data in place. Like if you know you have a good backup regime, which is going to back up your systems, back up your servers, that you've got it offline, that's not connected directly to your systems where it can get hit, then you can have confidence if you do get hit, that you can rebuild. You may have to do a lot of work to rebuild, but you'll have confidence that you may have the data from 24 hours old or something like that. So having a good backup regime in place is really good. You also have to hope that the criminals didn't actually steal your data as part of the process, because if they've stolen your data, even if you paid, which hopefully you're not going to be in that position, you don't know what they're going to do with that data. They may threaten to publish it. And so you really have to hope that they didn't steal it, and also hope that you've got proper monitoring in place, and so that you can see if that did happen. So even if they tell you they've stolen your data, if they haven't, you might be able to look and say, no, I'm confident they haven't stolen our data. So therefore, they don't have that lever to blackmail us with. Also, having good kind of incident response plans in place is very important, so that you've spoken to in advance, and that people in your organization are well educated about what to do, because clearly this has to be a multidisciplinary response if it hits your organization. So when I'm going in kind of working with organizations who've been hit by something like this, you're looking for representatives from legal who can actually, make that call as to, kind of what exposure is the organization going to have through the various paths that you might choose, paying, not paying, data being breached and lost somewhere, liaising with the data protection commissioner if something has actually happened there. HR is often very important because sometimes you'll have somebody who's actually clicked on an email link and that might have triggered off all this response. And it's very traumatic for somebody to be identified as patient zero, the person who may have brought all this on your organization. I always say to people, look, if this happens to you, if you're the person who clicked, you're the person that wasn't protected from doing that. Like, we in the cybersecurity community have to try and up our game here so that we're protecting people from having that link served to them in the first place. So the fact that you got duped, it happens to people. It's human. We are human, but HR often have to get involved and mind somebody in that situation. In a situation where somebody is negligent, they see that something's happened and they kind of go, oh, I think I'll just shut that down, or hopefully that'll go away. I'm not going to put my hand up to that. There's issues there for HR to deal with. IT, kind of comms, kind of your PR, your data protection officer in the organization. And also the exec is normally extremely interested because they typically can't operate the business. And even if all systems haven't been hit, you're probably going to take some precautionary measures to kind of cut you off a little bit from the outside world while you're trying to deal with this if it's quite extensive. That decision about to pay or not to pay, it's a communal decision within your organization. And, as I said, quite often you're trying to establish if you've had a data breach or not. You can be dealt with many different twists and turns of this, as I've seen kind of over the years as you go through it. You may need to deal with being offline. And then sometimes people have a bit of a false sense of confidence about, well, I've got, my anti-malware, my endpoint protection in place, and so I'm not going to get hit. But the reality is that, it's a bit of a cat and mouse game in the cybersecurity world, where there are new vulnerabilities discovered kind of every day. There's new ways of attacking systems. And some antivirus software will only recognize malware that it's seen before. So it just needs a little bit of a tweak to make it look different so that your antivirus software won't actually recognize it as being ransomware or malware. Just to kind of sum it up a little bit, what's your best protection, if you do get hit by ransomware? And there is only one answer to that. It's to be prepared and to be expect to get hit by ransomware and have your ducks in line before you are. So trying to keep both your systems from an operating system perspective and all the different applications that you run, keep them patched, get the latest revisions that where you can and get them up on your system. So I know that's not always possible to do that quickly, but to make best efforts to do it, make sure that you've got endpoint protection in place and that that's actually up to date and running on your systems. And then trying to put some kind of, simple markers on your system to see if ransomware has actually got onto your system. And there are lots of different markers that can be set up to monitor, even if you don't have sophisticated monitoring. Even if you're not a large corporate organization who has fairly sophisticated monitoring, even as a small little organization, the existence of certain files, a lot of files getting renamed very quickly, a lot of file activity where you weren't expecting it. There's a lot of markers that you can actually look out for that are, won't always mean you've got ransomware. There can be legitimate reasons, but it might, so you can set things up to help you spot early in the cycle when something is happening. Making sure that you've got a good backup in place, a good backup regime, and making sure that you keep some copies offline. That's where we see a lot of organizations getting hit, because the systems that actually have their backups are connected to the systems and they get hit with the ransomware too. Making sure that your staff are trained in how to avoid getting infected by not clicking on links and visiting random websites, and also training them on what to do if they think they have been infected. Trying to help your user population by blocking known bad websites and links from them so that they're not there for them to click in the first place. So you're not serving up that information to them. As I said earlier there, making sure that you're monitoring your infrastructure, and also trying with your executive and your senior team to run through a few scenarios with them and get them to think about, if this happened, would I pay? Would I not pay? Does it make a difference if they've taken our data? Does it make a difference if they're threatening a particular individual as part of this? So running through the scenarios and thinking it through a little bit in advance, because in the heat of the moment, when the adrenaline is running, it's quite difficult to think clearly about this. And I know for me, I find when something like this happens to an organization, it typically happens on a Friday evening and everybody's thinking they were going home for the weekend, and you land in and it could be 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning when people are panicking, saying, what are we going to do about this? And trying to keep everybody level and calm so that it can be dealt with properly. But the more you've decided as an organization on a principle basis in advance the more likely it is that you're going to deal with a malware attack safely. So I'm going to try and hop into the Q&A here and see, are there any questions? Do organizations tend to notify the Guardi when they're hit by a ransomware attack? And some do, some don't. I know when I'm working with an organization, I would tend to advise them that they should inform the Guardi because they may be able to help them. They may be able to give them some advice as to where to go and what to do with it. And certainly, if they're looking to maybe try and rely on insurance or get external kind of help afterwards, it's always good to have reported it because basically it is a crime. So I think, at minimum, you're registering a crime and hopefully they may actually be able to help you and give you some advice. And in my experience, they're certainly not going to kind of go, they'll advise you not to pay, but they're not certainly going to turn heel on you and do something to you if you did decide to pay in the heel of the hunt in the situation. In my experience, do many organizations pay the ransom? In my experience, for the most part, not. There's definitely a lot of reports where, people don't disclose that they've paid. So I think people do sometimes pay for sure. But in my experience, for the most part, not. Now, I suppose a lot of organizations that I would be dealing with would be large corporate organizations. So they generally have, better controls in place to spot when something's going wrong. And they also would have, firewalls and kind of segments in place to try and stop the ransomware spreading maybe across their whole network. So they tend to be a little bit more protected. They'd have good backups in place for the most part. But I have seen organizations lose serious stuff like through ransomware. So but for the most part, I think not. Do you think organizations in general are doing enough to mitigate against a ransomware attack, or is there a sense that it won't happen to them? I think a lot of places when they get hit, they're kind of, oh my goodness, I really thought this wouldn't happen to me. I've heard of it, didn't really realize what it did, didn't realize how devastating it could be. And actually, I think there's, what we're going through at the moment from the pandemic perspective, larger organizations will have, business continuity plans and incident response plans in place to deal with something like that. How can we shift everybody from working in an office to working at home? And I do think that sense of that will never happen. How could that possibly ever happen? Maybe has gone, and people are a little bit more accepting that actually sometimes these extraordinary things do actually happen, and that there should be a plan in place. But yes, I think there often is a sense that things won't happen to them. And somebody here is saying a small but important observation. It's important for digital forensics to establish if data was breached and also what the infection vector was, regardless of whether the data was leaked to criminals. By definition, a breach in GDPR, ransomware incident affecting a personal data would always be classified as a data breach, illegally altered, and is quite probably reportable to the DPC. In the vast majority of cases that I've worked on, the client has operated to report something to the Data Protection Commissioner. I think where a client feels they can absolutely prove that data didn't cross the boundaries of their systems, it's not nice having something illegally altered, but it may not necessarily be a breach of someone's personal data. So I've seen people kind of interpreting either side on that. I wouldn't tend to advise somebody whether they should or shouldn't report. I think it's it's up to the organisation themselves. I would certainly ask them the question more to kind of get them thinking about, should I be reporting, rather than saying you should report. Most cases I've worked on, people have put a report into the Data Protection Commissioner, even when they don't know whether data has been breached or not, just so that they're actually starting that clock ticking and doing the right thing. From a digital forensics perspective, it's absolutely really important to figure out how the infection got in, because you can't shore up the hole if you haven't discovered where the hole is, and to evaluate, how far spread it's gone. So couldn't agree with you more. It's very important to do the forensics and actually log it all down, because if you don't cover off everything with forensics, then sometimes people would use ransomware as a smokescreen for doing another attack. And if you don't have everything well covered off, and you're busy over here fighting with ransomware, but you haven't done a full forensic investigation, you could have something else going on in your organization and you may not be aware of it. So it's really important to do that. Do you think organizations need to be more, probably around organizations? It often seems that cyber attacks tend to be kept quiet. Is there value in an organization holding up their hands and saying, I was caught? Personally, I think there's huge value in people, coming out and saying, this happened to me. This is how I dealt with it. I had huge admiration for Maersk, actually. The CEO came out and spoke about all the learnings that they'd had, that they had poor backups, poor network segmentation, all the root causes, because they wanted to help other organizations to make sure it didn't happen to them. And I think, that embarrassment factor where people are kind of, oh my God, this is so embarrassing. We've been hit by this. We're offline. I think the more people hold up their hands, the less of that there is. And I think the less power the criminals have as a result of it, because, nobody's going to say, I'm embarrassed because I was mugged and I was walking down the street. Like, there's not, the randomness of this is, not dissimilar. And it's, being perfect from a cybersecurity perspective doesn't exist. And unless you're walking along the street and you're kind of black belt self-defense, the likelihood is if someone goes to mug you, you're not expecting it. They've got some kind of manner of getting to you. You're going to get hit. And it's a similar thing. I don't think people should be embarrassed about being attacked. And in fact, there's quite a bit of data around where when people are attacked, there is a public perception, a little bit of loss of trust, but that it can go back up quite quickly again. And I think it's an opportunity, sometimes for organizations to do the right thing, do the socially responsible thing and be open about it. But I do understand that there are situations where, people feel that it's maybe not the right thing to do. If maybe there's been a bad breach of personal data to a small group of people, it's probably better to inform those people directly than to have it broadcast that information might be out there in the wild. I think it's very dependent on the breach concerned. But I think for the most part, I think it would be great if people were really open about the attacks that they hit, because definitely it would encourage other people to prepare properly for them and have their incident response plans in place. Another one here is, there one key thing every employee should be aware of at a minimum to help them in mitigating a ransomware attack? One key thing, I can think of a few key things, being really cautious on emails from unsolicited sources, things they weren't expecting, or an unusual email, even from a contact, or something that's kind of, purporting to be from a contact. So being really careful about what you click into and attachments and things. Like, I sometimes notice I get quite legitimate stuff from people and I just think, I'm not clicking into that. I really don't want to. So we have our click phishing kind of button in work, and I often click phishing on perfectly legitimate documents, because I'm thinking, they'll send it to me again, they'll come back onto me if it's important. I'll just stay away from that. So I think having that air of caution before you actively click on something, and maybe being a little bit cautious about websites you go into, when you're kind of surfing around, that, clicking into things kind of indiscriminately as you go through a website, that, you can get caught that way too. And I suppose so being careful about where you click, but the other thing is about being speedy on putting up your hand and saying, I think I've done something wrong. Like, worst case, you haven't. And best case, the faster you report it, the faster your organization will be able to respond, and typically the lesser the breach. So 2 things: don't click, and tell somebody really quickly. We are a Wannacry survivor. We didn't pay, but thanks to a good backups and our cloud infrastructure, we tried. I don't know if that's we tried. We operate a zero trust environment. Our weakest link was our human firewall. Any advice on getting staff to take on board? We train them regularly and do regular phishing exercises. Kind of it is. I think probably the answer to my last question probably goes with that as well, about not clicking and about reporting quickly. And the weakest link is very often the firewall, like upwards of 90% of cases, the human firewall in these situations. So having that zero trust environment is excellent, because that means that people are really only going to get access to things that they really need access to. So they're not going to have that broad-based access where kind of the damage is broader. But I think training often is probably the case there. Like, if you're doing kind of annual training where you're telling people to do and what not to do, it's probably not enough. You need to keep training and retraining people and doing regular phishing exercises with them. I think you're doing all the right things, but unfortunately we are human. And I believe that the technology controls need to get stronger to actually trap these things, I don't know, maybe with time delays or whatever in the background, to help people protect them from themselves. Maastricht published a very good executive report on how they fell foul of ransomware in late 2019 and what they learned, and they decided to pay the ransom. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to read up on any of that information that you have access to, because it's just going to arm you with, how do I make that decision? And what we sometimes see is that the executives who actually at the end of the day probably have to make these decisions maybe are the ones who are, aren't as informed about it. So making sure that you get these reports up to people who will ultimately make the decisions, the pay or not pay decision, is really important. Thank you very much to everybody for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. Upcoming webinars, Fresh Faces in Cybersecurity. So Dina and Fiona will be presenting on the 24th of June. So again, thanks very much for listening, everybody. And hopefully I will get to catch up with some of you in person soon. I will look forward to that.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this webinar, please follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn to be kept up to date with all our news, events and programmes. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel for more videos like this one.